um, question and answer box that you'll see there. We'll do our best to get to the questions as best we can, but we may not get to all of them. An important note, if you are seeking continuing education credits, please know that you'll need to attend the full session, and you will need to attend from a computer, laptop, or a tablet, as attendance from smartphones does not allow Zoom to track your attendance appropriately, so that could affect your eligibility. 3 weeks after the event, you will receive an email from the Society of Counseling Psychology Continuing Education Chair containing links to an evaluation survey and the CE Certificate of Attendance request form. Today's session is titled Introduction to Critical Psychology in School Counseling and Clinical Psychology. We are honored to have the presidents of Divisions 12, 16, and 17, Drs. Jordan Wright, Antoinette Miranda, and Melanie Wilcox, as well as our invited speakers, Drs. Alex Pieterse, Jude Bergkamp, and Celeste Malone. We will begin by having each division president outline their presidential initiatives and discussing their visions for leveraging their platforms to advance critical health service psychology. Each president will then introduce a speaker representing their division. The president of Division 17 is Dr. Melanie Wilcox. Dr. Melanie Wilcox is an associate professor of counseling psychology at the University at Albany. Her research focuses both on quantitative and qualitative methods, predominantly on looking at issues of racial and social economic justice, including anti-racism and whiteness work, particularly in the context of psychotherapy and clinical supervision in higher education. Her research also focuses on social justice more broadly, including social justice theory, critical whiteness studies, and economic and LGBTQIA justice. Her overarching goals are to improve psychotherapeutic services in higher education for members of historically minoritized communities, and to better understand the factors that hinder advancement toward equity and justice. Dr. Wilcox has provided numerous peer-reviewed and continuing education presentations on multicultural orientation and clinical supervision, structural competence, multicultural training and education, social class, LGBTQIA issues, including trans affirmative care, anti-racism, as well as addiction, substance abuse, a clinical area of expertise and passion of hers, as well as trauma and psychological assessment. She has held a number of leadership positions in the American Psychological Association and its divisions, currently serving as president of APA Division 17, Society of Counseling Psychology, and she's a member of the APA Committee on Economic Status. She has received a number of awards from the American Psychological Association, as well as the Society of Counseling Psychology. She is also a licensed psychologist and board certified in counseling psychology. She also works part-time in private practice, providing psychotherapy, clinical supervision, and psychological assessment via telehealth. The president of Division 12 is Dr. Jordan Wright. Dr. Jordan Wright is a clinical associate professor and program director of the combined clinical and counseling psychology PhD program in the Department of Applied Psychology at New York University. He received his PhD in clinical psychology from Columbia University, as well as a master's in psychology and education from Teachers College, Columbia University. He's a diplomat of the American Board of Assessment Psychology and American Board of Professional Psychology, and a fellow of the American Psychological Association and the Society of Personality Assessment. Jordan's scholarship centers on two main areas: social justice, LGBTQIA psychology, and psychological assessment. He has authored multiple widely used books on psychological assessment, including Conducting Psychological Assessment, A Guide for Practitioners, 2nd edition, Essentials of Psychological Teleassessment with Susie Rayford, Essentials of Psychological Assessment Supervision, and with Gary Groth-Marnott, the 6th edition of the Handbook of Psychological Assessment, the most widely used text in graduate training on assessment. His latest book, Essentials of Culture and Psychological Assessment, was released in fall 2024, and is currently working on the next edition of the Handbook of Psychological Assessment. Jordan is the founding director of the Center for Counseling and Community Wellbeing, the training clinic in NYU's Clinical Counseling Psychology PhD program, as well as coordinator and teaching the psychological assessment curriculum for the doctoral program. Prior to joining NYU, Jordan spent 5 years on faculty in the Clinical Psychology PhD program at Teachers College, Columbia University, where he coordinated and ran the psychological assessment training. He then spent 6 years on faculty at Empire State University, State University of New York, where he coordinated the statewide online psychological curriculum and served as department chair of psychology statewide. He also previously ran the mental health treatment department for the HOPE program, a workforce development program for chronically under and under, and unemployed adults in Brooklyn. The president of Division 16 is Dr. Antoinette Miranda. Dr. Antoinette Miranda is currently the chair of the Department of Teaching and Learning at The Ohio State University and a professor of school psychology. She has been at OSU for 36 years. Before coming to OSU, she worked as a school psychologist in New York City public schools. Dr. Miranda has extensive experience consulting and collaborating with urban and suburban school districts and has been involved in a number of collaborative projects with Columbus City schools during her tenure at The Ohio State University. Dr. Miranda has had a lifelong passion for making schools work for school-age children, especially those most vulnerable. Her research is focused on issues of diversity, such as developing effective interventions with at-risk children in urban settings, consultation services in urban settings, culturally responsive practices, and social justice. She was instrumental in transforming the OSU school psychology program to have an urban and social justice focus. Dr. Miranda was elected to the Ohio State Board of Education in November 2016 and was re-elected in November 2020 and recently completed her 8 years on the board. As an elected state school board member in Ohio, she worked to promote practices that provided equitable service to the children of Ohio. She has over 50 publications and has received numerous awards recognizing her work, advocacy, and service, including Outstanding Trainer Award, OSU Alumni Award for Distinguished Teaching, OEA/NEA Advocate for Education Award, Distinguished Alumna, University of Cincinnati, Ohio School Psychology Association Outstanding Advocate Award, National Association of School Psychologists Advocacy Award, and Champion of Children Awards, to name a few. She is a member of SEMA, the Committee on Ethnic Minority Affairs, and the American Psychological Association, and is currently president of the APA Division 16, School Psychology. Without further ado, I will pass along to Dr. Melanie Wilcox to start us off.
Thanks so much, Terrell, and thank you everyone for being here with us today. I'm really excited about this webinar series. And so, to kick us off, I'll be talking about, my presidential theme and this webinar series overall and what to expect. So as Terrell mentioned, I am currently president of APA Division 17, the Society of Counseling Psychology, and my presidential theme is advancing a critical counseling psychology. This builds on a recent history in the Society of Counseling Psychology, including numerous presidential initiatives and themes related to liberation psychology, critical consciousness for transformation, uprooting anti-Black racism with unapologetic boldness, and justice, joy, and resistance. It's also consistent with our updated counseling psychology values that include critical consciousness, advocacy, accountability and repairing harm, liberation, and healing. And while these themes are central to counseling psychology, they're also crucial to all of health service psychology. And core to the counseling psychology value of collectivism is collaboration over competition. We have a long history of working collaboratively together across specialties to advance social justice across health service psychology, and we're excited to continue to extend that tradition. We've made a lot of advances in the scholarly literature in the past several years as it pertains to anti-racist and anti-oppressive perspectives, but research also consistently demonstrates that these perspectives don't permeate the health service psychology graduate curriculum. So a core goal or set of goals for this webinar series include training the current and future trainers and providing a compendium of resources that we will make available for future self-guided learning, as well as integration into classrooms and other learning spaces. This CODAPAR grant-funded series is a joint initiative across Divisions 12, Clinical Psychology, 16, School Psychology, and 17, Counseling Psychology. And it's called Advancing a Critical Health Service Psychology. Critical psychology is a term that is increasingly invoked, but may not always include clarity of definition. So what is critical psychology? Critical psychology is really an umbrella term that encompasses numerous approaches and perspectives, and as such, it doesn't have a singular definition per se. It has its roots in critical theory, a philosophical tradition that emphasizes the analysis of power and oppression and the transformation of society toward equity and justice. Any critical theory-grounded approach will center the critique of mainstream oppressive forces, seeking to highlight the pernicious ways by which power structures truth, knowledge, and ideology. Critical psychology, therefore, emphasizes critiquing the status quo within and outside of psychology itself and highlighting the role of oppressive systems and oppressive conditions. It's a framework for understanding how white supremacy, racism, and colonialism have shaped both the field of psychology and shaped human suffering. and a framework for moving away from adaptation to and enablement of oppressive conditions toward a psychology of liberation and healing. Speaking just for myself, it feels very now or never for psychology broadly and health service psychology specifically to centrally address the social and material conditions of distress. Are we as psychologists prepared to address and disrupt the rise in honest-to-goodness overt white supremacy and racism? How many of us feel equipped to treat the proliferation of opioid and stimulant addiction and from the perspective of its systemic and structural roots? For that matter, how many of us are aware of how our addiction epidemic parallels that which characterized World War II German society? How many of us feel equipped to help people who are suffering as a result of disinformation, conspiracy theories, many of them racist? I could go on and on about the modern problems that we're facing. And how many of us are trained to have the language to describe this psychological distress and disruption as the result of anomie, which critical theorists have described as alienation and purposelessness that results in significant mental health and social detriments, and that results from a breakdown of society and its social connections. These are very much psychological problems, and yet we have a psychology largely not trained to conceptualize and address these problems, and crucially, address their antecedents. Despite decades of research debunking myths of genetic causes, we still largely treat psychological problems as either predetermined or resulting from personal choice, as opposed to the downstream result of upstream structural violence. We ignore the causes that do, in fact, have empirical support, such as racism, economic inequity, and other forms of oppression, trauma and loss, and alienation and isolation. Until such analysis becomes the standard of the health service psychologist, I worry that we risk rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. It is my deepest hope that we can elevate and extend the work that has come before us through this series and other initiatives to make available the tools of critical analysis and make their adoption more widespread. Thank you again for being here today. I hope that you find today's webinar and the rest of the series helpful and informative. We have a really wonderful lineup of speakers to kick us off, including up next, Dr. Alex Pieterse. Dr. Alex Pieterse is an associate professor and director of the Institute for the Study of Race and Culture at Boston College. He received his PhD in counseling psychology from Teachers College, Columbia University. Dr. Pieterse's scholarship focuses on psychosocial aspects of race and racism, racial trauma, and anti-racism training and advocacy. Dr. Pieterse is a fellow of the American Psychological Association and the incoming editor of The Counseling Psychologist. He is also a licensed psychologist and maintains an independent psychotherapy practice. With that, I turn it over to Dr. Pieterse for our first presentation. Thank you, Dr. Pieterse.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I want to make sure that I am sharing my slides, am I?
You're sharing the slide deck.
Sharing. Okay, there we go. Right. So thank you very much for the invitation to spend a few minutes with you. I'm doing some critical reflection on critical psychology and anti-racism. I will also, whoever is keeping time, please feel free to make sure that I stay on track with my time, because people know that I am rather verbose. But I am coming to share a little space with you, and you will see that it didn't come up. I added a little 2 words to the title of my comments, which is Confronting and Undoing Structures of Racism, Implementing Anti-Racist Practice with Urgency. For some reason, it's not up there, which means I'm coming to you somewhat with a heavy heart, given the current political state that we find ourselves within, and also the fact that what we are talking about today really seems to carry a real urgency. So as a reminder, let me share with you words from Dr. Martin Luther King, delivered to the American Psychological Association in 1967.
Modern psychology has a word that is probably used more than any other word in psychology. It is the word maladjusted. It is the ringing cry of modern child psychology, maladjusted. Now, of course, we all want to live the well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities. But as I move toward my conclusion, I would like to say to you today, in a very honest manner, But there are some things in our society and some things in our world which I'm proud to be maladjusted. And I call upon all men of goodwill to be maladjusted to these things until the good society is realized. I must honestly say to you that I never intend to adjust myself to racial segregation and discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few, leave millions of God's children smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society.
It is striking, of course, that these words delivered in 1967 continue to have as pressing urgency today in 2025. And some of the factors that Mel alluded to that are currently constructing our practice and our science in psychology. So for a few minutes, I just want to engage with you in honest reflection on thinking about what a critical psychology, from my perspective, an anti-racist psychology can look like, and perhaps it needs to look like, and why that is the case in 2025. So I'm sharing with you various aspects of what I have come to understand as a process of resistance. I typically acknowledge the people on whose shoulders I stand because I would not be here without them. But as I've been thinking more about doing this, I've come to appreciate that in doing this, I'm actually engaging in an act of resistance, because part of what white supremacy and other oppressive ideologies want to do is to pull us apart. And the more we lean into and recognize the contributions of people who have come before us in the context of anti-oppression, I think the better place we'll be in, and also recognize the people that hold us up as we do this work every day. I've also come to recognize that my focus on naming and recognizing subjectivity is also a type of resistance. George Dyer, Canadian Ghanaian psychologist, reminds us that as academics and researchers, our social locations affect the knowledge production process and our interactions and dialogues with those who co-produce knowledge with us. He reminds us that the production of knowledge is political. We all bring multiple and different understandings to the social world from our different subjective positions and identities. So even as we are engaging in this space this morning, to an extent, we are engaging in a political act. In regard to my own positionality and subjectivities as resistance, I share this with you just to let you know that my thoughts come from my positionality in this society as a Black, cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied male. My own experience of race informs what I bring to my study. My experience of being a father, bringing up 3 Black men in this racialized society, also informs and gives me motivation for the work that I do. I've had particularly gut-wrenching discussions with our youngest son over the past 2 months as he has tried to articulate to me his experience of fear based on his own subjectivities in this society and the messages that he consistently is receiving that his young life does not matter. Okay. So these are the subjective places that I am joining with you this morning. So anti-racism. I love the work of Mohobe and their definition of anti-racism, which is a reminder that in approaching anti-racism from a critical perspective, we reject the understanding of anti-racism as merely prejudice reduction or respect for diversity, even though the very idea of respect for diversity is currently being challenged. We reject the idea that it's merely prejudice reduction or respect for diversity, but we lean into the idea that anti-racism is about individual and collective resistance and change of social systems which distribute advantage and oppression on the basis of socially constructed and hierarchical racialized categories, which is what Dr. King was telling us back in 1967. Why the ongoing need, especially as psychologists, to engage a critical perspective to what we do and who we are as a professional scientific discipline. We understand that the history of the United States is steeped in oppression, and we also appreciate that, unfortunately, our discipline has, to some degree, facilitated, colluded in, and given justification for the oppressive. So here, these awful words by Andrew Jackson. What strikes me is the language that speaks to psychology, the intelligence, the moral habits, the desire for improvement, the favorable change in condition. So this is language that we tend to be familiar with. And in this case, Andrew Jackson is using this language in a devastatingly oppressive manner. We understand historically that our science has provided justification for systematic oppression of individuals, groups, communities. This is a table that's almost nonsensical, yet in times past was given as justification for the inability of people of African descent to manage their own health, and therefore they would benefit from enslavement. Just on Wednesday in the psychological testing course I'm teaching, I shared with students this little piece from the history of psychology, which we currently completely disavow. Okay? A study that was published in Corrective and Social Psychiatry, Journal of Behavior Technology, Methods and Therapy, which fortunately is no longer in publication. But this is a study that looked at homosexuality as pathology and then shared data to indicate the efficacy of certain psychotherapeutic approaches to the curing of homosexuality. Cure rates are definitely on the increase, and for the majority of homosexuals, it is a matter of choice if they desire to be changed. Now we can look at this and distance ourselves from the history of our profession, but what I want you to sit with is the tremendous impact this type of science had on individuals and the extent which it continues to have. And then for those of us as practicing psychotherapists, Ellen Herman writing perhaps tongue-in-cheek, but asking us to think about the function of psychotherapy and proposing that perhaps on some level psychotherapy is a strategy for the manufacture of normality. So when we're talking about critical psychology, anti-racist psychology, ways in which we want to challenge structures of oppression, we recognize that we are fundamentally speaking about power. Okay? And as Angela Saini in a wonderful little volume, Race Superior, The Return of Race Science, reminds us that knowledge is just not an account of what we know, okay, what we know, but has to be understood as something shaped by those who happened to hold power when the account was written. Okay. So this is why in 2025, January 28, we are still convening to think how, as a discipline and as a field, we can enact anti-oppressive practices that facilitate the health and well-being of folk that we are working with. So we need to appreciate representation as resistance. Representation, of course, can take many forms, but I'm sharing with you data that speaks about numerical representation. And this slide essentially tells us that there continues to be an incredible disproportionality within our discipline as it relates to racial and ethnic representation. And I, again, from my own positionality, I was very struck by the data that spoke to the presence of Black American or Black African American males in the discipline. So even though as a collective we represent 5% of psychologists, in regard to gender, out of that 5%, 17% are Black men. So think about the impact of the lack of representation of Black men in our field. Charday and colleagues published a wonderful piece in the Journal of Clinical Child and Adolescent Psychology, which they essentially looked at the efforts around recruitment and retention of scholars, graduate students, scholars of color, indigenous scholars in our field. And in their conclusion, they indicated, and this is stepping outside of counseling psychology, it's referencing clinical psychology, they indicated that programs have been making efforts to recruit graduate students and faculty of color. However, there has been less attention to ensuring that these individuals are welcomed into warm, inclusive environments. Okay. Now think about that statement in the context of what we are just currently experiencing, a very aggressive pushback against any efforts that are focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And even though this study was in clinical psychology, I will share with you that a study that I published with students who were working with me at the time looked at the experience of students of color in counseling psychology doctoral programs, and to some degree, from a qualitative perspective, reported similar experiences of at times feeling a lack of belonging, experiencing overt and covert racial discrimination and oppression. So why am I encouraging and presenting as an imperative the need for us to think about our work from an anti-racist decolonizing perspective? I would just share with you that a racist or colonial science clearly imposes theoretical frameworks that are limiting and perhaps even distorting in regard to our understanding of psychological development and human functioning. As an example, a colonial framework tends to prize the individual and tends to marginalize a focus on interdependence or communalism. We also have to recognize that our discipline occurs in a larger industry of profit. And so to what extent does psychology as industry hurt our ability for psychology to be liberating? And then clearly, if we have a psychology that continues to center whiteness, it by default marginalizes and harms those who are outside of the white frame. I would share with you, with humility, some steps for perhaps a decolonizing psychology. And I think in order for us to engage in decolonizing resistance, we have to do partly what I've done very briefly, which is to expose the nexus between race, racism, and science. Okay. I think in our accreditation standards, we have to request, we have to demand, we have to require an extension of our models of healing to include non-Eurocentric, indigenous approaches to healing and well-being. Clearly, we need to normalize multiple perspectives in our teaching and identify the influence of racist science. And in this regard, I would share with you, there's lots of material at our disposal that can really center in some indigenous, non-European centered perspectives. Okay. Again, I think we need to call for the abandonment of practices that confer inferiority, especially in the context of psychological testing. And then perhaps we need to be active in engaging organizations that continue to collude in racist practices, and in that sense move beyond apologies, but demand acts of reparation. Okay. So as I conclude, let me share with you that if we are going to engage a serious understanding of how we can expand, it's not to say that we are not, but doing critical psychology in some domains, but how we can expand that sphere, we need to examine the structures that we find ourselves living in. Okay. Again, unfortunately, our discipline, including our professional associations, in some areas have a very unfortunate history around how they have engaged with oppression or oppressive structures. So we have Roy Edelson's recently published book, which gave a kind of expose of the way in which American psychology was complicit in some of the inhumane practices that the United States engaged in around the time of the War on Terror, as it were. We had our professional association offer an apology for the way in which psychology has contributed to racism. But then in a published, in a very recent publication, confronting scientific racism in psychology, we had ongoing reminders that there is a need to remain vigilant and remain attentive to how oppressive structures continue to permeate our science and our knowledge production. So I will share with you that given the current climate that we find ourselves in, which has a rather chilling air to it, APA has responded, although I would say the response has been somewhat muted, although I recognize they are working within the limitations of their own parameters. But I want us to draw attention to how, as a profession and as professional organizations, we are responding. And is there a need to perhaps respond with a greater level of urgency? Finally, in conclusion, I will share with you what of the main takeaways I've brought with me from my work over the years as a diversity consultant and doing some consultation around anti-racism work. When I go into organizations, schools, mental health clinics, etc., the most frequent question I have been posed is, how do we do this? How do we do anti-racism? And I've come to appreciate that that question is actually the easiest question to ask and the easiest question to answer, partly because we have volumes written on how to do anti-racism. And again, there's nothing I can say to you this morning that would be more compelling, more powerful than what Nicole Buchanan and her colleagues wrote in this wonderful piece, Upending Racism in Psychological Science. So we have lots of answers to how. I think the most important question is why and will. Even as we engage this space this morning, what is our motivation for engaging critical psychology? Is it performative, or is it indeed going to be transformational? And perhaps the most important question is, are we willing to do this? Do we have the will to do it? So I appreciate you allowing me into your space, sharing some thoughts and some reflections. I encourage all of us to move away from performative approaches, but to really embrace and enact anti-racism as something that we are. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to respond to questions or thoughts when we have time later on in the presentation. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pieterse. We are extremely grateful for your insights, your wisdom, and sharing it with us. So thank you very much. My name is Jordan Wright. I am the current president of Division 12, the Society of Clinical Psychology. Clinical psychology makes up the majority of licensed psychologists in practice. And it's still currently, as Dr. Pieterse was saying, currently overwhelmingly dominated by white, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, and otherwise privileged category statuses. This may be shifting, but currently the face of those helping often does not look like the face of those being helped. And there is shockingly little guidance on what our privileges mean in the work that we do, how they affect the process of psychotherapy, assessment, and the many other functions we psychologists serve, and how to manage our privileges in that work. Clinical psychology touts psychological science as its core, but too little of our science is devoted to truly understanding, managing, and addressing the oppressive forces that too often do not affect us, the helpers, in the same ways that they affect those we are trying to help. Clinical psychology on the whole is frankly, unfortunately, behind both counseling and school psychology when it comes to understanding privilege and oppression, structural competency, and other core aspects of critical psychology. This is why critical psychology is the cornerstone of my presidential platform this year for the Society of Clinical Psychology. Now I'm grateful to introduce Dr. Jude Bergkamp to talk more about these important topics in clinical psychology. Dr. Bergkamp is the chair of the clinical psychology program at Antioch University, Seattle, as well as clinical faculty in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Washington. He serves as president of the National Council of Schools and Programs of Professional Psychology, NCSPP, which includes more than 100 professional psychology programs across the country. He was trained in forensic and neuropsychology and has worked in the Washington State Department of Corrections and currently is a forensic evaluator in the Office of Forensic Mental Health Services in Washington State. He's a recipient of the Psychologist of the Year 2019 from the Washington State Psychological Association and the Distinguished Alumni Award from Antioch University in 2018 for his work on immigration reform. His current research interests include the decolonization of psychology, the exploration of social privilege as the flip side of oppression, and the role social privilege plays in psychotherapy. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jude Bergkamp. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much, Jordan. Really appreciate it. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. All right, so hello, everyone. Again, my name is Jude Bergkamp. I have to say I am super humbled to be here with all of you today. And today I think I'm just going to share some of my confusion and a little bit of irritation. And so I am deeply in love with psychology and at the same time profoundly dissatisfied with it. I've been a part of psychology for 30 years, and it's been such a lifeline for me to understand myself and others. But at the same time, as I seek psychological insight into the topics of imperialism, colonization, power, and oppression, I experience a lack of wisdom. And it can feel like it's beyond just a lack of knowledge. Could it be a purposeful avoidance and a system of discouragement for our scholarship in these areas? Thus, I believe that psychology requires a critical interrogation. So the title of my talk today is Disconscious Psychology, the Conflation of Socially Conferred Privilege. So today I'll offer some concepts that have been really useful for me, including socially conferred privilege, rank versus status, and this idea of target agent rank. And I'll also encourage us to interrogate psychological concepts with a structural competency lens. So first, let's go ahead and take a look at what is socially conferred privilege. So Black and Stone kind of amalgamated the existing definitions and identified 5 specific elements of socially conferred privilege. 1, privilege is a special advantage. It's neither common nor universal. Second,
Sorry, Dr. Bergkamp, your screen is not sharing. I just want to make sure that you know that.
Uh-oh, okay. Sorry, thanks. Let's see here. Let me do this.
Much better, thank you.
Better?
Yep.
Thanks, Jordan. Appreciate it. All right. So again, privilege is a special advantage. It's neither common nor universal. Second, it's granted. It's granted by historical, structural, and institutional sources. It's not earned or brought on by an individual's effort or talent. Third, privilege is a right or an entitlement. It's related to a preferred rank. Fourth, privilege is exercised for the benefit of the recipient and to the exclusion or detriment of the other. Put a pin in that one because I'll come back to that later. And finally, and I think most importantly, a privileged rank is often outside of the awareness of the person possessing it. This, I think, is an essential kind of kryptonite when we try to deal with this idea of socially conferred privilege. So Joyce King offered this concept of disconsciousness that has been very helpful to me in my thinking. And she defined this as an uncritical habit of mind that justifies inequity and exploitation by accepting the existing order of things as given. So this isn't an unconscious kind of an action. This is sort of an intentional pushing things out of our awareness. And this can be done in a socially constructed way. Those who hold privilege, actually, we help others who also hold privilege maintain and encourage disconsciousness. Then another concept that is, I think, very useful from Nieto is this idea of rank versus status. So rank is static and pervasive across context, time, place, and relationship. Rank connotes an identity domain, usually occurring by the lottery of our birth, in which historical, institutional, structural, and generational forces have dictated worth, access, safety, and ease of volition. Rank determines if we have privilege or the lack thereof. For me, in my positionality, I'm cisgender, straight, able-bodied male with citizenship. Those are all ranks that I carry across. This is in contrast to this idea of status. A status is dynamic and changing between context, time, place, and relationships. Status can involve interpersonal prejudice and discrimination, as well as temporary and contextual minority positions based on identity domains. But it is without the historical and institutional underpinnings. Thus, we all have some kind of status power in our role as psychologists. Now, I'll come back to this idea of highlighting the conflation between rank and status later. But when we talk about rank, I just want to highlight that then we have this idea of in each identity domain, we can hold agent or target rank. So these terms refer to the privileged or oppressed aspects of our identity domains. While authors use marginalized, minority, or oppressed as terms for the target, those who are experiencing oppression, it seems very seldom that there is a clear term to identify how each of us has privilege and rank as agents. So most of us have done some kind of social positioning, social mapping. And here on the left, you see Pamela Hayes's addressing model, kind of dissecting ourselves into each identity domain. But each one can come with agent rank or a target rank. And most of us have some of both. Today, I'm really calling upon psychology to put a bigger emphasis on that agent rank, the places we hold privilege. So this fundamental rank versus status conflation, I notice happening all over the discourse, and especially now. So an example could be that a white individual attending a majority BIPOC high school, where they feel like they're one of the only white folks around, this can call out their whiteness and encourages false claims of reverse racism. Or another example could be a male identifying individual, man, working in a company with mostly female identifying colleagues, women. This calls out his male privilege and encourages and can encourage hollow reverse sexism types of theories. So these status minority experiences threaten our bubble of disconsciousness and can blind us from the truth of historical, structural, and institutional privilege. A privilege-blind psychology can function in a very similar manner, encouraging the same type of conflation. Our current discourse, I believe, focuses on leveraging our status as psychologists to help empower, advocate for individuals in their target ranks, helping those who are experiencing oppression. Yet this limits us to make change at the individual level and implies that target rank experiences of oppression can possibly or somehow be cured or permanently helped with psychology. There is a lack of acknowledgement of our agent ranks that reinforce our psychologist status. This serves to maintain disconsciousness of our privilege and results in us feeling good about our efforts and possibly absolves us from structural responsibilities. In a way, as we as psychologists with our status are helping those folks who have been oppressed, it can somehow encourage our disconsciousness that, like we talked about before in the Black and Stone definition, like of essence number 4, that in fact, as we're helping those, we may be complicitly benefiting from the exact kind of system of oppression that we're trying to help our clients and others. So what if we refocused from helping the oppressed to interrogating the etiology of oppression? Let's ask about what the role of agent rank has on oppression dynamics, and specifically, who benefits? Do current psychological concepts reinforce disconsciousness by placating us in our role as helpers and advocates? Does it blind us to our own socially conferred privilege? Diane Goodman described oppression and privilege as two sides of the same coin. She elaborated, stating, while it is critical to understand how some groups are disadvantaged and oppressed, the other side of the coin is understanding how some groups are advantaged. We need to look at both sides in order to understand the whole dynamic of oppression. So what could be an alternative? Could we interrogate our common psychological concepts, such as resilience, psychological safety, cognitive reframing, and self-care with the following questions? Does the concept reinforce disconsciousness? Where does socially conferred privilege fit into this concept? Does the concept locate the pathology within the individual and imply that healing is an individual or that oppressed individual's responsibility? Does the concept define functionality in terms of an inhumane capitalistic system? If we begin to interrogate some of the psychological concepts that in a way we have worshiped and reified for so long, how could we do that? What's a series of questions that we could ask? We could ask, who coined the term or founded the concept? Was it mostly folks with a lot of agent rank? Was it culturally appropriated from somewhere or someone else? what was the social, political, and historical context at the time in which this term or psychological concept originated? Does it reify Western imperialistic principles of individuation, meritocracy, self-reliance, or gender norms? And do our current psychological concepts account for the historical realities of power, privilege, and oppression? So to close, I assert that our field needs a critical interrogation that honors the wisdom of the past, but also has the courage to make this profound shift from helping oppressed individuals, which we need to continue to do, but also to recalibrate all of psychology in the context of power, privilege, and oppression in order to avoid the implicit, possibly like unintentional good that we're trying to do. This would move us, I believe, towards a true structural competency. Here are the references. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jude and Jordan. My name is Antoinette Miranda, and I am the president of Division 16, School Psychology. School psychology stands at the intersection of education and mental health, serving as a critical force in advancing equity and challenging systemic oppression. Its evolving focus reflects a forward-thinking approach, one that aligns with the principles of critical psychology to address inequities in education and the broader communities it serves. School psychology leverages critical psychology to dismantle structural barriers, advocate for marginalized populations, and promote transformative practices. As a person who spent my whole career championing diversity, equity, and inclusion for the most vulnerable and marginalized youth, recent events and the election has spawned divisive rhetoric and policies targeting minority groups, such as restrictions on DEI, immigration bans, erasure of LGBTQ rights, that have fostered exclusion and discrimination, and most importantly, fear. School psychologists are uniquely positioned to apply critical psychology principles because their work involves collaboration with diverse stakeholders, students, families, educators, and administrators. They operate within systems that directly impact students' opportunities and outcomes, making them key agents of change and promoting social justice and equity. But it is critical that we are trained and prepared to meet these challenges head on, which is not always the case. Since 2020, Division 16 presidents have adopted platforms focused on anti-racism and anti-oppression. This has included a school psychology unified anti-racism statement and call to action, 3 school psychology anti-racism unit conferences, a task force on censorship of DEIJ initiatives in education that produced a playbook to counter the censorship, and my platform focused on advocacy, which to me seems the next logical step to address the oppressive climate in which we exist today. Critical psychology's commitment to systemic change aligns with school psychologists' advocacy efforts. Beyond individual interventions, school psychologists engage in policy advocacy to address structural inequities. They work to reform disciplinary policies that disproportionately affect students of color and students with disabilities, advocating for restorative practices as an alternative to exclusionary discipline. As a division, our call to action is to embrace a vision of education and community services as a tool for liberation, commit to addressing the root causes of inequity, not just its symptoms, and lead with compassion, courage, and a commitment to justice. This bold, transformative approach ensures that school psychologists not only respond to oppressive forces, but actively works to build a more inclusive and equitable society. We are honored to be a part of this important and consequential webinar series as health service psychologists must be the leaders in advocating for policies that protect and promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, which includes pushing back against legislative efforts that limit conversations about systemic oppression, historical injustices, or marginalized identities. It is with great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Celeste Malone. Dr. Celeste Malone is an associate professor at Howard University and serves as core faculty for the specialist and doctoral school psychology programs. Her research focuses on multicultural competence, the ability to work effectively with diverse populations through the application of cultural knowledge and to demonstrate awareness of and sensitivity to cultural issues. Dr. Malone is also an independent equity, diversity, and inclusion consultant. In this role, she bridges the research practice gap by disseminating her research and providing professional development to state departments of education, university academic departments, school districts, and local schools. Additionally, through her work with national professional associations, Dr. Malone has expertise in strategic planning, leadership, and collaboration, and professional advocacy. Welcome, Dr. Malone.
Good afternoon, everyone, and it's truly a pleasure to be here with you all today and to be part of this critically important webinar series. I distinctly remember when I had my first practicum class after the 2016 election, and I asked my students what they were witnessing in schools, and they discussed the palpable fear that many of the students and families experienced. Fast forward to now, and the president's current initiatives, particularly around immigration and transgender individuals. And it's more important than ever that all psychologists, but particularly those in school-based practice, are prepared to support and stand up for affected students, because students will be affected by these policies in schools, but they have no choice but to attend. So in the context of my presentation, I'll be presenting an overview of what is happening in schools now and the oppressive environments that students are in, and describe how school psychology practice can transform to be more healing-centered. I start with my positionality because who I am shapes what I do and why I do it. I identify as Black Caribbean American. Both of my parents are from the Virgin Islands and my extended family is still there. However, I was born and raised in the United States, and I'm a child of pre-gentrification Harlem. I'm a cisgender heterosexual woman, non-disabled, and college educated, and I deeply value all of the connections and the communities that I'm a part of. I'm a daughter, a sister, an auntie, godmommy, soror, leader, and professor. And through the multiple environments that I've been in, predominantly Black environments, I am a strong believer in the resilience and brilliance of Black communities. As Dr. Miranda mentioned, in 2020, the profession of school psychology, all of the US-based school psychology organizations came together in the midst of the US reckoning with structural racism following the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and made a commitment to use psychological science to combat systemic racism and foster change at all levels, including in pre-K through 12 schools and professional places. And within this, I want to highlight a few key points from our Declaration of Understanding: that school psychologists must confront their internalized racism and implicit biases. We also have to confront the explicit biases that are in pre-K through 12 schools, as well as in school psychology training programs, and then learn how to think and act in ways that affirm communities of color. We made a promise to support and protect our children of color who were disproportionately targeted in our schools and communities. And then lastly, we committed to call out those within our profession who act in ways that are antithetical to our values. And that last point highlights our collective responsibility to hold each other accountable and support each other as school psychology moves towards racial justice. So while that statement was a significant step towards social justice for school psychology, we cannot ignore the other oppressive systems that impact us due to our gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability, social class and socioeconomic status, country of origin, as well as our other sociocultural identities. We also have to examine how these oppressive systems build upon each other such that individuals with multiple minoritized identities are placed at greater risk for oppression, discrimination, and harm. Within school psychology, and arguably within psychology and education more broadly, we focused on single axis frameworks, which ignore the heterogeneity within groups and assumes that identity categories like race, gender, and ability are standalone on their impact on students. It is critical that school psychologists and psychology as a whole recognize oppression in all its forms, because for many students, particularly those with minoritized identities, schools have always been sites of oppression, and the current socio-political environment has made things worse. First, consider asymmetric power relations. We have a predominantly white educator workforce and a multiply privileged educator workforce working predominantly of students of color and other minoritized backgrounds. They are in positions of power and privilege due to their job role, but then also because of the sociocultural identities that they hold, those privileged identities. And they use their power from their social positioning and from their employment to exert power over students and the choices that they're able to make. There's an equitable access to educational resources and opportunities based on school location and demographics, such that schools with high percentages of racial and ethnic minoritized youth or economically marginalized youth are less likely to have a broad array of educational opportunities. And then lastly, deficit beliefs about marginalized students are reflected in their treatment at school, with experiences of overt and covert discrimination and microaggressions. When we examine oppression, there's often a greater focus on the interpersonal level, this middle level here, without recognition of how oppression is embedded in structures through institutional policies and practices. So consider school discipline practices that are predominantly focused on policing minor and subjective behavior, coupled with very vague definitions of discipline infraction categories. And those vague policies, or the policing of students' behavior, lead to Black, disabled, and LGBT youth being disciplined more frequently and more harshly under the discipline categories of disrespect, defiance, and disruption. We also don't really consider how individuals internalize these oppressive experiences. So for those individuals who have marginalized sociocultural identities, in schools, they see themselves deprived of opportunities that other students are able to learn about their history or use the bathrooms in which they're most comfortable, and they start to internalize an inferior identity as they're denied opportunities. Then on the flip side, those with privileged identities start to develop deficit biases about marginalized groups as they notice that they are getting the advantages and privileges that other students do not. And they develop a sense of unearned privilege, as Jude mentioned earlier. And we see all three levels of this type of oppression present within schools. So again, those school policies that are vulnerable to bias in terms of discipline, special education identification, and dress code policies, experiences of microaggressions and overt discrimination, and then the internalization of those experiences, which cause psychological distress, such as internalizing concerns, anxiety, and depression. It may also lead to externalizing behaviors for which students are often disciplined for instead of supported. Now, while not all oppressive experiences will be traumatic, as school psychologists and psychologists in general, we must be aware for the potential for traumatic impact. Consider these criteria and considering what happens in schools. So first, considering frequency or repeated nature. One incident alone may not be traumatizing, but as students experience multiple microaggressions over the course of their educational experience, that could increase the traumatic impact, and not just directly experiencing those microaggressions, but then also witnessing the discriminatory treatment of their peers. Next, we consider the relationship between the individual and the perpetrator of oppression. When we have these school-based incidents related to oppression, it's not a stranger off the street who doesn't know the student, but typically students are being targeted by individuals that they know and presumably trusted, such as their teachers or their peers. And then when we consider public humiliation and the lack of public intervention, these oppressive experiences often occur within the presence of other students and school staff, and they often go unaddressed by school administrators. So when I consider the oppressive environments that students are placed in and how we respond to them, I think about this parable of the boiling frog. So the boiling frog is a fable describing a frog being slowly boiled alive. The premise is that if a frog is put suddenly into boiling water, it will jump out. But if the frog is put in tepid water, which is then brought to a boil slowly, it will not perceive the danger and will be cooked to death. Schools are the pot of boiling water. We mandate that kids attend from an early age, and from preschool, minoritized students are experiencing bias, discrimination, and differential treatment. In response to students' reactions to oppression, such as anxiety, depression, or anger, we're teaching them coping skills to manage their emotions. But rarely, if ever, do we discuss the school experiences that are contributing to their distress in the first place. And this continues throughout their entire educational careers. Some frogs jump out, such as those who may drop out of school or who are pushed out of school through exclusionary discipline. But others remain, their emotional, spiritual, and mental energy constantly drained and their identity and well-being eroded. As school psychologists, we could take the pot off the water or turn off the stove, yet we don't. And again, we're responding by giving them or teaching students coping skills. And coping is not inherently bad, but it only helps kids survive in these oppressive and draining school environments. It does nothing to change them. But in the words of education scholar Bettina Love, we want to do more than survive. We need to name, face, and work to eradicate these oppressive settings so marginalized youth are not repeatedly traumatized. And that will require us to shift from coping to healing. Now, promoting healing is consistent with school psychologists' role as social justice advocates. Presented here on the screen is the social justice definition that was adopted by the National Association of School Psychologists, and the one that we see cited most frequently in school psychology research. So when we look at this definition, it highlights the importance of working towards equitable outcomes. We want to ensure equity for all students, but really, that's just the bare minimum. We want all students, especially those with marginalized identities, to experience liberation and for their full humanity to be recognized. In school psychology, most of our discussions about social justice have been disconnected from its anti-oppressive roots. School psychologists are often well-intentioned. However, they often rush in to act without centering the perspectives of those most impacted. And so in their desire to help, they may end up replicating oppression while they're trying to pursue equity. Now, to take a closer glance at this social justice definition and how we could more closely tie it to anti-oppressive roots in a lens, taking this first sentence from the definition, social justice is both a process and a goal that requires action. What does that look like when we bring an anti-oppressive lens to our social justice work? First, it's considering the process, and that's the intentional inclusion of affected communities, that we're not acting on communities' behalf without meaningful engagement, and we have to be willing to follow their lead. That requires us to demonstrate cultural humility and recognize the expertise that we hold as school psychologists, but also not being dismissive of the lived experience, knowledge, and skills that have helped communities survive and resist. Next, we consider our goal. And as I said before, equity is only like a midpoint. The true goal is liberation, envisioning a world that is free from interpersonal, institutional, and internalized oppression. And then what does our action look like? We should be focused on empowering and working alongside of affected communities, not rushing in with our capes on to save them instead, because communities have the skills and knowledge and strength to survive. And how can we amplify that? And we also challenge unjust systems through advocacy. And so, as I mentioned before, school psychologists are often very well-intentioned when it comes to their social justice work. However, as we rush in without examining our biases, we can cause harm and contribute to structural racism, as demonstrated by this model here. So first, considering the biases that we have. Through media exposure, direct and vicarious experiences, as well as messages from family and friends, we are primed to view marginalized groups in a more negative light. When we do not examine the biases and beliefs that we have, we then develop policies based on our assumptions that racial and ethnic minoritized students and other marginalized students are inferior, they're more dangerous, they're less intelligent, and they need to be policed. This contributes to the creation of policies that deny some students access to opportunities and material goods. And differential treatment leads to disparate outcomes, which further reinforce deficit-based implicit biases. And it's important for school psychologists to understand this connection between our individual beliefs and how we could contribute to structural oppression, not just for ourselves, but then also taking this lens and looking at school psychology itself and considering, are our actions helping to dismantle oppression, or are they perpetuating oppression? So looking at this cycle of bias and structural oppression in school psychology, first, we start with priming associations and assumptions. Leitner Whitmer and G. Stanley Hall, considered to be the founders of school psychology, endorsed eugenicist ideas in their work. And their students then developed instruments that were used to identify those who were worthy of education. And that led to the exclusion of racial and ethnic minoritized groups. Those beliefs still persist and affect how we recruit and retain individuals within school psychology. So for example, recruitment from historically Black colleges and universities is a cited strategy for diversifying school psychology. However, HBCUs report very little outreach from school psychology programs. And further, school psychology graduate students who came from HBCUs often report experiencing microaggressions, suggesting that their education was inferior. And then continuing on, this belief that diversity topics are not important to school psychology. As an example of that, the Thayer Conference, which established school psychology along with our professional standards, was held in 1954, the same year as the Brown versus Board of Ed decision. However, there is no mention of the Brown case at all in the proceedings of the Thayer Conference, which suggests that school psychologists were not considering the cultural context as they developed the standards for the profession, and they didn't see it as relevant. How that has played out is limited coverage of multicultural topics in school psychology training and research, along with the continued use of problematic, culturally neutral practices. And that has contributed to limited growth of racial and ethnic minoritized individuals across all levels of school psychology and diversity more broadly within school psychology. That despite over 40 years of position statements and efforts to diversify the field, school psychology remains over 80% white, female, non-disabled, and English monolingual. And we're the least diverse area of health service psychology. So as we consider the oppression that occurs in schools, as well as the oppression present within school psychology, we have to ask ourselves, how have we been complicit in maintaining oppressive systems? And then more importantly, how can we move from complicity to action? And to do so, I draw on the framework of critical consciousness. Critical consciousness is defined as an individual's capacity to critically reflect and act upon their socio-political environment. When we bring critical consciousness into our work as school psychologists, it allows marginalized students to externalize the source of their trauma and hurt, as opposed to thinking that they are flawed, because they recognize the impact that racism and other forms of oppression are having on their lives. And we also could use that and leverage it as a treatment tool, because engaging in social action and activism can increase psychological well-being and sense of empowerment and agency. And as we work to develop critical consciousness within school psychologists, it could also help them feel more efficacious in terms of their social justice work and increase their commitment to engaging in social justice. Critical consciousness is a thread that weaves between these three theories that are integral in reimagining school psychology. And so first, liberation psychology, which is the use of psychological approaches to understand and address oppression by drawing upon the experiences and knowledge of marginalized groups. If we empower marginalized groups, they are feeling empowered to engage in transformative action to change their social conditions. Next, critical school psychology strives to explore how school psychology has been complicit in oppression to create new spaces in school psychology that are accessible to and representative of marginalized groups, and to foreground the experience of marginalized groups by strengthening school psychology's connection to other social movements. And then lastly, the psychology of radical healing acknowledges oppression as a root cause of psychological distress and offers a framework to move away from individualistic coping to community thriving instead. And with those theories, and again, tying in critical consciousness, we could move towards healing-centered practices in school psychology, because school psychologists, we are more than just assessment and participating in special education practices. We need to move away from the quest for objectivity and our desire to sort and label, and to really think of how we could transform schools so that kids could really benefit. And so looking at self-awareness and cultural humility, identity-affirming school climates, developing positive student-teacher relationships, utilizing restorative approaches to school discipline, providing culturally responsive school-based mental health, as well as engaging in social justice advocacy, we could bring healing-centered ideologies into school psychology and transform the way that we work. So first, considering self-awareness and cultural humility. It's important for us to use tools such as the addressing model to reflect on the identities that we hold. Compared to counseling and clinical psychology, school psychologists aren't particularly self-reflective. We're not trained to be so. And then because we only look at race, we assume that there may be greater homogeneity within groups, and there actually are. And so by using the addressing model, we're able to understand ourselves, our experiences of privilege and marginalization from an intersectional lens, but that also primes us to better recognize the diversity within students and not just looking at them with a single lens. We also must demonstrate cultural humility by being willing to learn from marginalized communities and follow their lead. And that extends to students, because we have very much issues of ageism and adultism that are present within schools. And if we are serious about our commitment to serving students, we need to listen to them. Next, we create identity-affirming school climates. And first, we need to be aware of how educational systems are constructed to exclude students with marginalized identities, that there are multiple policies in place that limit who is able to fully participate and be welcome within schools. And we need to recognize that as such and dispelling other notions that we may have had. It's important for us to challenge implicit messages of who is and who is not a valued member of the school community, so consistently responding to any microaggressions that may be present. We teach students microintervention strategies so they can effectively address microaggressions and create a more affirming environment. And we don't just focus on attacking discrimination, but we create a more supportive environment through affirmations and develop students' social emotional skills through transformative SEL. Transformative SEL centers culture and focuses on equity. With respect to positive student-teacher relationships, school psychologists, we could consult with teachers so they could provide culturally responsive and sustaining teaching practices in their classroom so that students feel more welcome. And we also support the implementation of equity-centered multi-tiered systems of supports for behavior, which focuses on catching students on being good and not on punishing them or trying to catch them in misbehavior. We also look to reduce the use of exclusionary discipline by focusing on more restorative approaches. And so first, recognizing how exclusionary discipline is often used as a means of control and not of safety. And we could promote the use of restorative practices to prevent rule infractions before they occur and to intervene so that we're rebuilding and restoring relationships. And we're working with school administrators to develop trauma-informed approaches so students aren't further harmed and traumatized. For culturally responsive school-based mental health, we provide these services in a multi-tiered system of supports, where we're providing small group and individualized interventions for students as needed. We don't solely look for psychopathology, but we're also looking for student strengths and recognizing cultural specific risk and protective factors. And we develop students' critical consciousness so they can understand how oppression operates in their lives and affects their well-being. And then finally, as school psychologists, we engage in social justice advocacy. We empower students with self-advocacy skills and advocate on their behalf. We develop alliances with community groups so that we could address their needs and provide desired supports. And we also advocate to change the policies that are within schools and districts that are harming some groups of students and raise the public's awareness of the impact of these biased policies. So this is how we could work towards healing-centered practices in school psychology, transforming what we actually do. And here are some additional resources that could be used in classroom settings and graduate education programs to do that deeper dive so that school psychologists really understand how oppression has shown up within our field, and so we can more actively dismantle it. And their teaching resource, the Blue Sky Syllabus, has close to 200 resources that could be used in classrooms, again, to help graduate students understand how oppression manifests, but then also how can we leverage healing-centered practices instead. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
All right, all right. So I'd like to just send my deepest appreciation to our presenters for all of your insightful contributions. Your expertise and perspectives have not only helped to enrich our understanding of critical psychology, but has also inspired us to think more deeply about our own positionalities and critical issues at the intersection of psychology and justice. As a reminder to our attendees, you will receive an email with a link and a certificate for attendance within 3 weeks of today's presentation. But now, with the time we have left, we're going to shift briefly to a question and answer session, which will be moderated by myself and Dr. Gioni Lewis. So please feel free to send your questions through the chat function, to the Q&A function there on the Zoom screen. But Gioni, how about you kick us off with our first question?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much again to the presenters. Just amazing, thought-provoking conversation, particularly in this current sociopolitical moment. It's really important for us to be thinking about how we can move towards a critical health service psychology. So the first question that is directed to our clinical psych folks on the panel. So Jude, maybe you could try to answer this. So how is leadership thinking of the growing number of programs accredited through the Psychological Clinical Science Accreditation System, particularly top clinical psych programs? That organization is explicitly empiricist, curious how leadership in the divisions of APA are seeing this changing landscape and what it may mean for epistemic diversity and marginalization in clinical psychology.
Wow, that's that's a pretty good one. I think that might be a little above me or different than me. I can just speak as far as for NCSBP, which we're representing all the PsyD programs in the country and Canada, or trying to. And what I appreciate, I think, is Mel said something about this collectivist cooperation versus competition. And so it's just really this thought about how are we as a field just replicating the inhumane capitalist system in which we all live, and to whose benefit and to whose detriment, I would say. And so it worries me, that shift. And I would say that we just need to all in leadership positions, when we have that privileged status position as leaders, to counteract that kind of competitive vibe that's happening right now. And Jordan, any thoughts?
I'll jump in and add to that from a clinical psych perspective. I think that it's not limited to PC-SAS. I think that this is the Commission on Accreditation at APA. I think there's a lot of movement toward this sort of empiricist, positivist stance, and there is work happening. There are a lot of us who are working toward building competency models, working toward building special issues. And Mel, maybe you can do a little plug for our an invitation for our special issue upcoming, to really think about how do we need to come together as a collective group of people who care about this stuff, to advocate for change at that accreditation level, to advocate for the changes in accreditation standards, to help push forward those programs who have faculty. We've been there for a long time, and we are entrenched in our ways. And sometimes we need that nudge from accreditation, whether it's PC-SAS or APA, to make moves for the better for the next generation of psychology, to be more structurally competent, to be more critically conscious. And I think that that's going to take a collective effort, and it's going to take a multi-pronged advocacy effort that will include some of the topics that we're going to push forward in this webinar series, as well as other initiatives that are happening.
And ever so briefly, because I know time is short, certainly, look for the special issue of TEP and PPRP that Jordan and I are co-editing related to this topic. But I really want to encourage folks to use this as an example of an opportunity to apply the lens that we're talking about. What is the historical context in which this increasing adoption of white supremacy norms has overtaken pockets of psychology, right? It's the context of 40 years of funding cuts to higher education and delegitimizing of higher education, such that to survive, we have to sort of get on board and do what we're going to do with our cognitive dissonance, as opposed to critiquing why we feel compelled to lean further into these norms of white supremacy. But I also want to note there are some fantastic clinical science scholars, some of which Dr. Pieterse cited and elevated, that are fighting back against that. And so, we need to be highlighting and elevating that work.
Thank you. One last quick question, just because it's important for us to think about. And maybe to Celeste, with the situation of ICE in schools, what can school psychologists do in their schools to push back against this? What's going on right now?
Sure. And so the first thing is to be informed that there is a lot of misinformation out there about what these agents can do, what they can't do, and what their responsibilities are as a school psychologist. And so the first step that we've taken as a profession is providing information to school psychologists about immigration laws and policies and what that means to them. There's lots of know your rights information there, because as school psychologists are informed, they're also able to share this information with their colleagues, but then also to students and families to empower them as well. But it's really that knowledge piece. And we're having conversations within the profession of, well, what does this mean in our context of ethics and our professional practices? Recognizing that what is considered ethical practice in school psychology may become illegal. And so how do we combat that? And it's starting with having conversations, identifying our values, and being true to our moral core to guide us in what our next steps should be in supporting students and families.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate just all of your thoughtful contributions and engagement in today's webinar. Again, thank you to our attendees for tuning in. Please be on the lookout for the next webinar inside of the series. More information should be coming out to you all via email pretty soon. But we look forward to connecting with you all again next month. Again, thank you for your attendance, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much, everyone.